Thank you everybody for being here tonight. My name is Mica Anders, and I had the distinct pleasure of being the History Fellow for the Minnesota African American Heritage Museum and Gallery. I'm super excited to share just a snippet of this project with you. It was, I don't know, I guess a labor of love is the best way to describe it. Um, I spent the past 8 or 9 months, I would say, working on this project, but it started actually way before then. I also am a professional genealogist, and I had a friend who is also a client, I guess, more of a friend whose family descends from this area, and they provided me pictures of their ancestors who are in this presentation. And I did some research for them, and I learned that their family was in Owatonna, and they were also in Rochester, and they were also in Red Wing. And I thought, wait a minute, this is the 1860s, 1870s. I, as somebody who's not from Minnesota, did not know that there were Black people living down in that part of the state that early. And so I went to one of the local historical societies of those counties, and I asked some questions, and they also didn't know too much at the time. So it was really fun to do a little bit of digging then. But I kind of had to set it to the side. That was 2014. And then when this fellowship opportunity came up with the museum, I was really, really excited to apply. This opportunity was going to allow me to both do the research, which I really was excited to do, but also to design an exhibit. And like Miss Tina said, in addition to my work as a historian, I also am an artist. So the layout of this presentation is somewhat similar to how the panels are designed that are actually up in the museum. So I've had some questions from people. This presentation coincides with a 7-panel display that is up currently and will be up through July, but we'll talk more about that at the end. For those who aren't as used to the webinar format, I know I'm not, because it's weird to only see my face talking to me. You can't see each other, but you can type questions in the chat, and there's a Q&A and a chat, and feel free to use either one. I can see those if you have any questions as I go, but for the most part, I'll do questions at the end. So here we go. So I just really want to start off with centering sort of the why of this project and talking about where. So as you see, it's this 11 county radius in southeast Minnesota. And it's really, really important to note that African Americans have been in the state, and especially in this region, since the 1850s, which is way earlier than a lot of people realize. This was even before Minnesota was a state. It was still a territory at the time. The land had been forcibly taken from the Dakota people who did live in this region at the time, and was being redistributed for white settlers and white people to come and claim. And in addition to the white people that were coming, obviously African Americans were also coming, as well as other ethnic and minority groups, to the region to settle the land. The numbers were fairly small but mighty, I like to say. So hopefully you can see this a little bit. In 1860, according to the census, there were about 51 people living in the region that were Black, but from everything that my research assistants and I could tell, all of these numbers are an undercount. So there would be years when someone would be listed as Black, other years they were listed as mulatto, other years they were listed as white. When there was only 1 or 2 Black people on the page, very often the census taker would put a W at the top and just put a line down the page. They didn't bother to find those few people and mark them separately. So that made it really, really hard to find people. But that's what we did. So at the end of the day, people came for different reasons, right? Some people came for freedom. Some people came for a better life. Some people came for land. But at the end of the day, once everybody got here, they all formed part of their communities. They formed part of small Black communities within their towns, within their regions, and within the state, and even Iowa and Minnesota together, and Wisconsin. And then other people formed community with the white people with whom they lived. Depending on the town, depending on what those relationships looked like. But from all the records I've found, I would say for some it was a comfortable relationship. For others, the relationship between the white and Black residents was very close, and for some people it was somewhat tense. So the first groups that came I would call the early settlers and workers. Um, People arrived for a variety of reasons. Some came by choice. Some people were looking for land, like I said, hoping to escape the harsh conditions they lived in the South. Um, a lot of these people were either freeborn or they were called contrabands. And that's a term I use a lot in this presentation and in the exhibit. So a contraband is kind of a troubling term, but it's the term of the times. So basically, people who were enslaved, they would gain their freedom sometimes by crossing the Union lines during the Civil War, and they became, and it was contrabands, which is also a term of property, but in this case, they were free and settled as refugees across the Union lines, or some of them were freed by the Union troops when they came through, and others freed themselves by crossing the line and becoming workers. They worked as cooks and servants and things like that for the Union troops. Other people, and I think this is really important to note, did not come to Minnesota by choice. They were enslaved and they were brought to Minnesota as enslaved people, and they lived as enslaved people in Minnesota, both in this region and in other parts of the state, until emancipation. If you want more information on that, just learning more about the Dred Scott decision is really helpful. So the first family I want to talk about was actually not one family, but there's going to be two specific people from this group that I want to talk about. There was a group of freeborn African Americans who were living in North Carolina. And for reasons I haven't yet figured out, but it seems like it has to do with the Civil War coming. In the 1850s, they left North Carolina and made their way to Le Sueur County, which is right to the west of Rice County. They settled there in the late 1850s. It was a group of families. So as you can see from this, and I'm going to show some census records throughout, census records were one of the easiest places to start looking for people. So in this document, and I'm going to zoom in, don't you worry, there are a few different Black families all living together. If you notice, the whole page right here has no racial designation for anybody except the families who are listed as either Black, which is the little b, or an M or an MU, which is for mulatto. So, fun genealogy fact. The way we currently think about the word mulatto would be somebody who had one white parent and with one Black parent, but it used to have less to do with your immediate parentage and more to do with your skin color. So by looking at this, you can see that most of the people who came were fairly light-skinned African Americans from North Carolina. Another thing that's important to note is that these columns that I just circled have to do with how much money and how much land and property people had. And this group of people from North Carolina had more than the families around them, who all were white. So I just wanted to zoom in a little bit to talk about the specific family that I researched the most, and that was the family of John Boone and his wife, Missouri Pittman. So John and Missouri, again, they were part of this big group. They didn't come together as a couple. They came separately. John came with his parents, and Missouri came with her sister Eliza and Eliza's husband and children. So they moved here, and soon after arriving, they did end up getting married, and soon after that, John enlisted in the Civil War, as many of the people I'm going to talk about did. And when he left to go fight in the Civil War, Missouri and her family and some of the other families all moved from Tyrone over to Rice County. So, to my knowledge, and to the knowledge of any of the descendants I've talked to, nobody has any pictures that we found yet of John and Missouri. We do have pictures of their children, and they are all very, very fair complected. But we do know that John and Missouri were born in the 1840s, and it is believed that this house, if you can see my pointer, next to the old store, is actually their home, and up here above it is St. Olaf College. So they lived very, very close to St. Olaf College. John ran an orchard. He was also a carpenter by trade, as was his father before him. So a couple really interesting things about John and Missouri. They had a lot of children, and many of them survived to adulthood, but one of their descendants, their granddaughter, she was actually the first recorded African American to attend St. Olaf College. And that's a really fascinating fact. But even more fascinating about it is the fact that she was also, to some extent, white passing when she attended. And there's a really fascinating trend amongst a lot of the families I discovered where their descendants, especially if they were more fair complected, a percentage of them would become white passing, and a percentage of them became very actively involved in African American community. I haven't been able to figure out the why to that yet, but I'm really, really fascinated by some of those choices. And again, it's hard to know, the reasons why people chose to pass or chose not to. No, I didn't make this sketch. I wish I had, but I found this was given to me by another fabulous researcher to use. So another really great thing to know about John and Missouri is they were really well integrated into their community. They, along with a lot of other families who have a military history, were very active in the GAR, which is the Grand Army of the Republic. It's the Veterans Post. So John was actually a founding member of the post in his community. Another very early family, I would say that the Popes, this family here, and the Boones were two of the earliest families I found in the region. There are no pictures that I found of Jane and Jerry Pope, but they were one of the very first families I learned about doing this project. And they actually connected me with another set of researchers who worked really closely helping me with this project. So it seems as though Jerry and Jane were both born in the 1820s in Kentucky. It's not clear if they got married before they came to Minnesota, if they met in Minnesota, or if they both met in Kentucky and then came to Minnesota together. Those are the kind of details that have been really hard to find for a lot of these families. Excuse me. If you think about your family records, the way we know things is through descendants telling stories, letters that we find, and things like that. Excuse me. But for a lot of these early families, oh my goodness, my throat. Well, it'll pass. I'll just talk through it. For a lot of these early families, there's very few records that have been shared with historical societies. And so it's really hard to know the specific reasons why oh my gosh, my throat. The specific reasons why the families came. But what we do know is that Jerry and Jane were very early members in Owatonna. They're even listed as some of the early settlers in their obituaries. And Jane actually lived to be in her 90s. But somewhat soon after arriving in Owatonna, Jerry set up a barber shop in town, and he's known to be the first barber in Owatonna. His barbershop was called the Eureka House, and this is an ad from the newspaper from 1865 in Owatonna for his barbershop. Just in case anybody cannot see this very well, I'm going to read this, and every so often I will read things just to make sure that I'm being accessible for people with different vision abilities. So this is just an ad for the barbershop. It says, the undersigned would respectfully announce to the citizens of Owatonna that he has opened a barbershop at the Eureka House. So it goes on to say, shaving, shampooing, haircutting, and coloring will be done in the best style on the shortest notice. Those wishing anything in my line will please call, and if we don't shave you completely, it will not be our fault. No shaving done on the Sabbath. So Jerry Pope, fun fact, actually could neither read nor write, so all of this was done orally and somebody composed it for him. But he was still able to have quite a successful business, and he also took on apprentices. So not only did he bring himself and his wife into different conditions than they were born into, he also reached behind him and helped others along the way. He was super active in the community. He would spend time coming to St. Paul, which is where I live, to advocate on behalf of Black citizens. He worked with legislature. He would travel to Iowa. He participated in a lot of community events. So he didn't just come and wasn't just sort of this lone, he and his wife weren't just lone Black citizens. They worked really hard to make life better, not only for themselves, but for others around them. Unfortunately, they outlived all of their descendants. And so if they had any records, we're not sure where those may have gone. The next family I want to talk about, or the next person, is Mary McElroy. So we talked about how the Boones were freeborn and they came by choice. We talked about how Jerry, Pope, and Jane, we don't know how they came, but we know they were formerly enslaved. And that's also the case for Mary McElroy. So if you notice this record, this is a census record. This is from the 1865 Minnesota State Census. And for all my genealogists on the call, you may be slightly jealous because Minnesota took a state census on the fives for 1865, 1875, 1885, and 1895. So for those who don't know, oftentimes we only have a state census, which is taken every 10 years. So to have those fives really helps fill in the gaps as to figuring out who is who went where. Unfortunately, this census record is fairly blank. So there's just these columns and hash marks. It doesn't tell us where people are born. It doesn't tell us how old anybody is. It just gives us this little bit of information. So using this teeny tiny facts of, I know right here, this line means that Mary McElroy was Black. So that's all I knew. So we tried to look for her. Again, I had some lovely research help on her as well. We don't have any records of her before 1865 census. We don't have any records of her after the 1865 census that we know about. We don't know how old she is. We don't know her age. Like I said, we don't know where she was born, and we have no photos of her. But we do know that her name probably used to be Mary Prist, and this is why. So as you see here, these two little lines, and again, this is how the work worked. Literally page by page by page by page. My research assistants and I call them research assistants, but they're all fully qualified in their own right. I don't want it to diminish their work. So we would go line by line looking for any notice that had a little hash mark that indicated there was a Black person living in these towns. Since there was nothing else to find on her, oftentimes what you do in any type of African American research is you have to start researching the white people around them. Sometimes they're the keeper of the records. Sometimes if she's living with them, that means maybe they have something that talks more about her. And lo and behold, in this case, these two little hash marks that I circled that indicate that Benjamin and Daniel Densmore were soldiers. This was huge. Their papers as soldiers are located at Minnesota Historical Society. This was a complete fluke, and I didn't even find them until, I want to say, November or December, when I was supposed to be wrapping up everything, and I had to sort of stop the presses and say, oh my gosh, we have to go find these papers. So a friend and I went and we looked through a lot of these letters. As you see, they are original letters. They are the actual notes that the Densmore sons wrote back and forth with their father and their sister, who were still at home in Red Wing. In these letters, the Densmores came up with this concept. So they had Swedish housekeepers, and they kept losing their Swedish housekeepers. Either they weren't happy because there weren't enough other Swedish people there, or they didn't like their pay, things like this. So Orrin Densmore, the father, and his sons came up with this thing they called the Shady Question. Now, both of the sons were working very, very closely with the contrabands, as I said earlier. They worked with the United States colored troops. And so they decided, well, why don't we see if we can find a suitable, and I use that word very loosely, candidate to help work in Red Wing. So they began this huge search to find the right person, the right African American person, to come and be their housekeeper. Now, as I read these letters, at first it wasn't clear if they were actually going to be paying this person or if they were going to just have this person come work for them in almost an enslaved capacity. It turns out there was payment, so that was good. But seeing firsthand the way they spoke and the words they used was a little bit difficult. So I only put a few things in here, not some of the more difficult ones, but these are some of the letters. So they eventually got Mary, and at the time her name was Mary Prist. Her name did change to Mary McElroy. And another reason these families have been so hard to track is people were changing their names. Sometimes when they first got here, they had a name that they were given while in enslavement. They may have changed their first name, they may have changed their last name, and they became a whole different person in terms of trying to find them in records. So we have letters saying that she's here. They're really happy with her work abilities. Uh, the dad writes to his sons, "Your mother finds her help so far quite satisfactory, and housekeepers begin to inquire whether they too can procure contraband help." So when we talk about how did people end up in Minnesota, this is partly how, right? It was, oh, you have a black person working for you? I want a black person to work for me. They're a good housekeeper, they're a hard worker. There was this notion that they were harder workers than some other demographics and ethnicities. And so people thought, well, that's what we want too. So it's really unclear how many people came up through this system with the Densmores. There's not really good records to show that. There are boxes and boxes and boxes of letters, so it's possible that in more of those boxes we would find more. But the focus really was on Mary for this project and learning more about her. And like I said, unfortunately, she did not stay, or fortunately, I don't know how her treatment was. She did not stay with the Densmores very long because by 1870, they had another housekeeper again who was Swedish, and Mary has disappeared from the records. But in addition to the Densmores bringing people, there was actually a call by Generalsibley. He went on a mission to request contrabands to help with the later labor shortage. Because of the Dakota War and the Civil War taking place simultaneously, there were a lot of men who were of a certain age who left, especially the rural area, to fight in the wars. And because of this, there was a huge labor shortage. Um, Various people were brought in to help with that. Before the African Americans came, a lot of Irish came to help. But this news article, which I didn't copy the whole thing of because it's 2 pages long, talks about that Generalsibley and the community really didn't want any more Irish people. They flawless, or they saw the Irish as lazy. They saw the Irish as unethical, and they saw the African Americans as hard workers, as more loyal. It's really interesting because a lot of the words they used to then describe the Irish became the words that they later start describing African Americans with. So the call was put out to bring a lot of African Americans, up to 5,000 they wanted to come from St. Louis and other areas to help with the labor shortage. It's really unclear how many people eventually came. I haven't found any specific records helping find letters or these requests that Generalsibley sent out to see if people were coming. The Densmores were white, to answer your question. The Densmores were white, and Mary McElroy was black. And the Densmores actually went on to be really, really well-known members of society. They worked in the legislature or the Congress, I can't remember which, but they went on to be very politically active. But they did have this other side to them as well. So the Civil War, and I keep kind of talking about it, really was a turning point in people coming, African Americans coming up to Minnesota. Like I said, people were coming as contrabands. People were coming because the Civil War was starting and they knew it was not going to be as safe for them where they were living. But a lot of people who came actually came right after the Civil War, and they were veterans of the United States Colored Troops. So during the 1860s and 70s, like I was saying, those formerly enslaved people called the contrabands, they came to the southeast Minnesota region. So some came on their own. Some came with the officers. So for all of the people who served that were African American, they served in segregated units, and that was called the United States Colored Troops. The people who were in charge of them, their officers, though, were all white people. And so they sometimes formed really strong bonds and relationships with their captains and the sergeants in charge of them. in their units. And when those soldiers returned to Minnesota, some of the black troops returned with them. They often were enslaved prior to joining the Civil War. A lot of people got their freedom through joining the Civil War efforts and joining the troops. So that's why some people came. Others came because they never technically enlisted as soldiers, but they did serve, like I was saying, alongside either as cooks or servants. And so they came back with the white troops, a lot of the Minnesota divisions. There were a lot of Minnesotans in the Civil War. And so more than once, there's newspaper articles about them finding contrabands, as they were called, and bringing them back with them. So that's how a lot of people ended up here as well. So here's a couple stories. This is Alex Robinson. I don't have any pictures of his wife, Eliza. Now, Alex Robinson was a great example. So he was born enslaved in Missouri in the 1840s. He got his freedom by running away and working as a cook with the 10th Minnesota. When the colored troops were formed in 1864, he joined the colored troops, and he happened to join the unit where John Boone, who I talked about earlier, is one of those very, very early families, where John Boone was serving. So John Boone and Alex Robinson became friends as well as comrades in arms. And when John returned to Northfield, Alex came with him. So while he was here, Alex met Eliza White. Eliza was part of the group of early North Carolina families to come that were freeborn. She wasn't part of the initial group, and so just learning that led me to find out that not only did this group of African Americans come from North Carolina to Tyrone, Le Sueur, like I was talking about earlier, at least one other group came after them. So the two of them married, and then they also settled in Northfield. And Alex joined the GAR, again, the Veterans Post, and he served as the chief engineer. We would call it a custodian these days, but I really like chief engineer at Carleton College for years. So we're so fortunate to have photos of him because they're in the Carleton Photo Archive. And if you notice, both of these photos he has on military paraphernalia because he was a very, very proud vet and very active in a lot of the veteran efforts. He even served as a guard in the post. So a really interesting thing to note is a lot of the families who came that were veteran families, the women and the men would serve in the post. So often the women would join the women's auxiliary. And it seems like from the records and the newspapers that the men who'd served in the Civil War were treated, I won't say equally, but I'll say differently than some of the men who came in other capacities, right? So the men who were white who'd fought in the Civil War, and then the black soldiers who fought in the Civil War, they had a shared experience. They had some things they could relate to. They both were veterans, and so I think that really changed how they were viewed by community. The veterans posts were all integrated. And so officers in the post would be both former black soldiers or black veterans and white veterans. Another family that we have actually a couple photos of, and I didn't find these, another researcher found these photos, were Flora and Sim Boggs. So I think it's really important to talk about various ways people got here. So again, Sim, he was known as Simeon Sim Boggs. He was born in Missouri in the 1830s, and just like some of the other people I've talked about, he ran away, and he enlisted first as being part of a refugee camp, right? So he was a formerly enslaved person who was working with some of the white units. Eventually, he also became a Civil War soldier, but while he was there, he met Flora, who had done the exact same thing. She was in Louisiana while he was in Louisiana, stationed there, and she ran away with her baby son and crossed Union lines to gain her freedom as well. The story goes in her obituary that she was running with her baby son. She set him down because she didn't know if she would make it, and she started to go on without him. And again, this is what the story says, is that she ended up coming back for him and running on. So it's just, you just think about what was life like for her, that she was so whatever her treatment was, that she just had to cross the Union lines, had to get to safety, had to go from being an enslaved person to having refugee status. And it was, she almost left her son, but she knew she needed to take him with her, and they needed to both have their freedom together. So Sim is a good example of somebody who ended up in Minnesota because the general under whom he served while he was in Louisiana was from Minnesota. And so when the general came back to Dodge County, Mantorville, he came along with him. And so the two of them ended up living their lives in Dodge County. Dodge County had very, very few African Americans. I found only maybe one or two others documented in the county. So I always wonder what their life was like. But these photos are actually from their church. So they were clearly members of society. They were in the Methodist church, and these are their photos from the church bulletin. They became so well integrated into society that when Simeon died, and again, he was also a veteran, so it could be that he had that veteran status, and that really helped create a bond with some of the other white veterans in his town. This was part of the tribute that was given to him when he died. And it says, Sim was a slave, and Boggs, or Boggs at roll call, was a man. On guard, his salute, the general himself, was bound to return the salute. So that just talks about his status, right? He was a full man, even though he was formerly enslaved. So we've talked about veterans. We've talked about some of the very early families that came here. A lot of the families that came, whether they were individual men or families, or they formed families after they got here, they were farmers and they were laborers. And I think it's really important to think about what would that be like to be possibly the only African American laborer somewhere. If you look at this picture from Rice County, on the far left you see the lone African American man. I don't know who he was. We don't know who he was. And we just know that he was there. He was working. A lot of people came as individual men, and they didn't stay. So a lot of the records were in 1865, 1870. They'll show people with that hash mark that show they were male and they were African American. But by 1870, a lot of them were gone. Some of them moved because they weren't able to get land. Some of them moved because they were only here for work and they found community elsewhere. Some of them moved because of how they were treated while they were here. But again, all of it's really speculation because we don't have a lot of records to help us know exactly what their lives were like. But we do have records for this person and this person. So this is Joseph and Amelia. Joseph Parker was the start of this entire project for me. I'm so fortunate that his family had these photographs. Like I said, there's very few photographs that I have found of a lot of the people that I've researched. Joseph was born in the 1830s in Kentucky. He was enslaved. He got his freedom by joining the U.S. colored troops, like a lot of the other people we've talked about. After he was discharged, somehow, and again, I have no idea how, he came to Minnesota. And he, like many of the laborers, moved around a lot. He lived in Owatonna. He lived in Red Wing. He lived in Rochester. He lived in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And every time he would kind of start in Owatonna and go other places and come back to Owatonna and go other places and come back to Owatonna. So clearly he had some community there. We know that he was tied to the Pope, so I talked about way earlier. That was that early barber in Owatonna. Jane and Jerry Pope actually signed his marriage record. So that shows us there was community, there were connections. But again, I still don't know how people found each other. Joseph Parker could neither read nor write. The Popes could neither read nor write, but somehow they found each other. There were no telephones. They couldn't write letters, but maybe they had other people write them for them and read them for them. So they were able to connect and form community. And I am in awe honestly, of how people were able to communicate with each other and create community and create bonds without a lot of the modern technology we have and without the ability to read or write. And it's not like a lot of the families knew each other. They met once they got here. But how they even knew there were other Black families, nobody's really sure. We don't know if it was word of mouth. If people said, oh, hey, you're Black. There's another Black family 3 towns over. Nobody knows. But in this case, this family is really well documented in the newspapers. And Joseph was, because of his Civil War service, he qualified for and received a Civil War pension. And I was actually able to, because I'd researched this family previously, I was able to get his pension files. And in his pension files, I learned a lot more about how he met Amelia and how the two of them got together. In his pension file, it says that Joseph brought Amelia from Byron, where she was living, and brought her to Rochester, and the two of them settled there and formed their family. Amelia was born in Washington, D.C. She, again, this was all from the pension file, so it's amazing where you find these records. But she came to town with a Methodist minister. So a Methodist minister brought her from Washington, D.C. to Kaysen, Minnesota, which is a fairly small community in Dodge County. And she worked there as a housekeeper and a domestic for a number of years. And then, for whatever reason, she moved from there to another small town called Dodge, or called Byron, which is where Joseph found her, brought her. Again, we're not quite sure how they met. As you can see, they're about 30 years different in age, but they married, they formed a family, and their descendants actually are still in Minnesota to this day. So they are on their 7th, maybe 8th at this point, generation of Minnesotans, starting off with the two of them. So I think they're just a really good example of everyday people, right? They just live their lives. They were part of community. It seems as though they may have been one of the first Black families to live in Rochester. All of their kids went through the Rochester schools. After Joseph died, Amelia and her family and her children ended up coming up to Rondo, and some of them still are here today. But I love this note that I got from one of the descendants. If you think about somebody who moved around a lot, you have to think about, how did they get vouched for? Who knew he was a good worker? And so the descendants still have this letter from E.J. Blood, who was a proprietor of the St. James Hotel in Red Wing. Joseph worked there for a few years, and he had to carry this letter with him when he left to show what kind of worker he was and to show he had a letter of reference, a letter of recommendation for wherever he went to work next. Some of the examples I'm giving are really kind of to highlight what a lot of people's experiences were. I think for me, there's only so much time, there's so much room on the panels, there's so many photos that I don't have, that it's like, how do you figure out who you're going to showcase? How do you figure out which stories to tell? And so I want everybody, when they leave, to know that these weren't all of the people. This was just a snippet of people who have a story that could be very similar to a lot of stories of a lot of the different people who were here. Lewis and Delilah Harrison, I think, are a fabulous example of another group who formed community. So Lewis was born in Kentucky in the 1840s. There's a lot of ambiguity about Lewis. Even his name is fairly ambiguous. It's said that he was also a veteran. It's said that he was in the 13th U.S. Colored Troops. He was a member of the Veterans Post. And are the Parkers related to the Parker family that lived? Very, very possibly. They're related to the Jones family, who is also in the area, who you probably know, Miss Van. So I'd have to see if they're related to the Parkers, but I think they probably were. So the Harrisons, Lewis Harrison said he was a Civil War veteran. He was a part of the Veterans Post, but there are no records of a Lewis Harrison in any of the Civil War databases in the 13th Colored Infantry, in the 13th Colored Heavy Artillery. So it's a little bit confusing how we know that he was a veteran. But He did say he fought in the Battle of Nashville. That's in some of the records. And so it's very possible that he changed his name. You know, there's some notes off to the side on one of the documents from a veteran who was his contemporary that said he may have had a different name, but I haven't found any records of him. So, what I think is really fascinating is, according to Houston County, which is where they lived, Lewis came and he got land that was quote unquote leftover. And again, I want to always use anything about land very, very loosely. None of this land was available, it was taken. After the white settlers came through and claimed, quote unquote, the land that they wanted, there would be land that was left over, again, quote unquote, left over. And some of the Civil War vets were allowed to come and claim this land. So it's believed that's how Lewis ended up in Houston County. The land he started in was not the most hospitable, but he didn't live there alone. If you notice, again, most of the page is blank. It's just nothing but some little hash marks to indicate white. But all under his household, and again, I know it is small, so just bear with me. Lewis is right here. He's listed as a farmer with Delilah and his children, and at least 2 other families all live together on his land. So he, like Jerry Pope I talked about before, didn't just bring himself up. He found Black community. He created his own little Black community in Houston County, where they all lived together. And eventually everybody would get their own land. They would get their own spaces, and other times live with each other. So there was very much a sense of helping each other out. You know, if you need somewhere to stay with me for now till you get on your feet. Once you get on your feet, some of those people would bring other people in and help them out to get them on their feet. It was really a beautiful community that they formed. Again, he owns property. That's what this little circle I did is. He owns property. He has money, more than some of the other people living around him. And again, we believe he started out as an enslaved person who got his freedom fighting in the Civil War. So just zoomed in a little bit so you could see Lewis and all of the different people that were living with him. There seems to be no clear sense that any of these families were related. They're all from different states, but it's hard to know because, as we know, it's possible that they were related, were sent to other states, and then once freedom came, they were able to reunite as a family. So it's really unclear. But what is clear is Lewis not only had land in 2 different places. If you see the document in the middle, he got a patent for his land as a homestead. He's one of the few that I found in the area that did actually get a homestead. A lot of people may have tried to get land. There has been documented, I guess it's been documented that oftentimes when Black people would try to secure land through the patent process and the homestead process, the patent office would somehow lose their application, or they would say it wasn't filled out properly, things like that. So rather than being more overt racism towards them that just says no, you can't have it, it was more covert racism and more systemic that was keeping a lot of people from being able to get land. But Lewis ended up with land first here. This is the original land where he had all of the other families living with him. And then he moved, this is in Union, and then he moved to Hoka, where he lived the rest of his life. And he had 3 plots of land in Hoka, and this is the patent for his land in Hoka. So I think it's just really important when we think about why are there no Black people there now, right? You think about, well, who gets to keep land? Think about the people who have had land in their families for generations. And, when people are systematically kept out of the opportunity to get land, it's much, much more difficult to have that legacy and that property that people carry forward. So we talked about laborers, and not everybody was a laborer, right? Not everybody farmed, not everybody was a laborer. There were other people who came. They started businesses, like we talked about with Jerry Pope earlier. Some people came, they became very prosperous. Some people came, they worked service jobs. Some people came, they started restaurants. They started grocery stores. One person, Alexander House, he followed what many would consider the American model, right? He was born in Alabama in the 1850s. We don't know how, but he said he was orphaned and he came to Dover, which is in Olmsted County, in 1866. It's not sure how he came to Dover. He started out living with a man named Calvin Hilt, who was from the Minnesota Second, a white man. So it's very possible that, kind of like I talked about earlier, Calvin Hilt, who was a white Civil War vet, met or befriended or something with this young boy, Alexander House, and brought him with him. Because every time I see Calvin or Alex has moved, the other has moved also. So for all of their lives, they stayed somewhat close in proximity to each other. So they clearly had a connection. But no records have been found to indicate anything more about how they're related or what their connection might be. Anyway, so Alexander House was very enterprising. He started out as a farm laborer, and then he ended up working as a laborer at a grain elevator for C.S. Ingham. And when he was working at the grain elevator, he literally worked his way up from being a laborer to helping to build some of the new grain elevators. One of the grain elevators, not necessarily C.S. Ingham's, is in the background on the picture on the left of the Dover train depot. So just an example of what would have been a contemporary grain elevator when Alex House lived in Dover. He worked his way all the way up to being promoted as an engineer. And even from there, so he went from laborer to engineer, all the way up to being a grain buyer himself. He even worked with the Cargills. That was one of the companies to whom he sold grain. In addition to working as a grain seller, he was a meat inspector. He traveled back and forth to Chicago to the stockyards, looking at the different beef cattle that were there. And if that weren't enough, he also was a hotel proprietor. So Alexander married Edith McAllister, who was a white woman. And Alex himself, from all records, it seems, was quite fair complected. In all the records, their children are listed as white. So, like I talked about before, sort of, they all just became white after Alexander. His children were listed as white on all records. I don't know how they personally identified. I only know how they were listed. Their mother was white also. So he and his wife Edith ran a couple different lodgings in Dover. So again, Dover, clearly a very small town, but Alexander and his wife ran first what was called the Huffs Hotel. Unfortunately, it burned down in a fire. And then they ran lodging houses. And once a new hotel called the Dover Hotel was built, they took over as the proprietors of that as well. So they were well known, well respected in society. People enjoyed their cooking. People enjoyed where they, people enjoyed their cooking. People enjoyed their service. And so it was just really interesting to see that this is just an example of somebody who just worked his way up from being an orphaned boy in Alabama to being really well known actually in Dover. Now, something that's really frustrating about him being so well known, he has a huge tombstone. I have found no photos. Olmsted County has found no photos. We haven't been able to track his children very well. And nobody knows anything else about him. So I would love to see photos, know more about him. But we do have a photo of the depot and newspaper articles, lots and lots of newspaper articles about him. And for Alexander House and many of the families I've talked about, the newspaper became the main source of learning about them. Newspapers in the 1860s and 1870s were the social buzz of the times. It would say things like, Mr. and Mrs. House went to such and such town to visit Mrs. House's sister. So all of a sudden you're learning where relatives are going, people are coming to town, when babies are born, when people are getting married, things like that are all listed in the newspaper. So it was an amazing resource that Minnesota Historical Society has put a lot of the newspapers online. Some of them that aren't online, I was able to work with some of the local historical societies and they were able to pull some of their newspapers for me. Or I went to the microfilm rooms and really started scanning microfilm to find some of these early newspapers. But it was life-changing to have access to these newspapers. I don't even think this project would have been possible without them. So Eli Fields, and I have only a few more minutes to talk, and then we'll have questions in a little bit. So Eli Fields was born in Kentucky, another person of whom I have no pictures, but he ran a couple barbershops. He started out in Winona, having a barbershop there, and it's not clear if he was an apprentice there. It looks like he may have actually lived in Ohio as a barber even before then. And I want to pause and really just talk about barbering for a minute. A lot of the early African Americans, especially the men who came, were barbers. And like I talked about Jerry Pope, some of that is because a barber would bring other barbers up behind him to work as his apprentice, help them get started, and sometimes they would set up their own shops in the same town. Other times they would set up shops in neighboring towns or other communities. And so it became almost like this network of bringing people into town, helping people get jobs, helping people develop skills. They were apprentices, help acclimate them to this rural society, helping them in this very new society for some of them, especially if they were from the South. And it became a pipeline, honestly. And so Eli Fields was a part of that, right? So he started out in Ohio. Like I said, he was born in Kentucky, but he got his start in barbering in Ohio, we believe, working for another barber. Came to Winona, worked as a barber, and then set up a couple shops. He had a shop in Red Wing, mostly in Goodhue County. He also was known as somebody who was quite fair complected, and he also married Eliza. Her name was Eliza Riddler. She was an English woman, a white English woman, and they had 4 children together. His barbershop was clearly very profitable. So we don't know if colorism played in, and that's how he was able to be such a successful barber. We don't know. It seems that he wasn't somebody who fought in the Civil War, but we know that he was pretty well known in society, and he had multiple shops. So he would set up a shop, and every time his shop moved, he would post in the newspaper, which again was the best way to find out more about him. So he would post in the newspaper where his new shop was. Here's an ad right here that says E. Fields, barber and hairdresser, next door to the Astor House. All kinds of work in my line done in the most unique manner. The hair chart on the left is not his, but I wanted to just show some of the hairstyles that these black barbers were cutting. This is from 1884. Now, sort of in a contemporary sense, we think about you go to barbers who have hair like you. But in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, there were white barbers and there were black barbers. And the barber associations themselves were actually integrated as well. So some of the early black barbers were members of local barbering associations and held officer positions. And so it seems that barbering, again, was a very integrated profession. Some historians have talked about barbering being sort of an odd middle ground because it was still very much a service role. You were very, very at the hands of your white clientele. But it also, for some, they didn't serve black clientele. Some only served white clientele, and then that created some distance between them and the black community. Others served both, some in the same place, others in different places. So there's a lot to barbering. There's whole books actually on the black barbers, even here in Minnesota. There's some pretty well-known barbers in this area and right outside in Hastings, for example. So I don't want to spend too much time on barbering because I could go on a whole tangent about it. But we do know that Eli and Eliza had 4 children together, but only unfortunately 2 of them survived to adulthood. But he did have quite a successful business. So as I talk about really bridging community, right, talking about there's the black community, the white community, and that some of these early African American families really bridged them and had their foot in both worlds. I think one of the best examples of this is Ben Day. So Ben Day is from Rice County. He was born in Wisconsin. So he, unlike a lot of the families I talked about, was not born in the South. He was born in the North, in Wisconsin. He, like his father before him, was a barber. He learned the trade from his father, who also took in apprentices, as I've talked about, right? That barbering network that carries people through. He started out barbering in Wisconsin, and then he moved from Milwaukee as a barber to Rice County, Faribault, Rice County. He very quickly, it seems, became a member of society. At some point, he went from being known as Ben Day to Professor Ben Day. None of us have yet figured out exactly how this happened. I'm very curious to figure out more about how that change happened. Um, he was very, very well known around town. He, as you see in the picture on the left, was quite integrated into white society. The picture on the left, he's in the foreground, seated in a chair, and there's a group of 5 white men standing behind him. All of them have their hands together. They're not touching him, but they are wrapping their hands together. And the back of this picture, I got this from Rice County Historical Society. It says something about New Year's Eve or New Year's Day carolers with their coachman, Ben Day. On the front, all of them are listed. For whatever reason, they're listed with a number in their name. Ben in the front isn't listed with either, and his names are in quotation marks. So the historian in me immediately goes to the why. And that's a lot of how these projects go is, why is his name in quotation marks? Why is he seated like that? And those questions have been really fun to try and work through, try and answer, because those really give a sense of who people were and how they were viewed in society. So when Ben was part of society, like I said, his obituary, which is the picture in the middle, that obituary is from the St. Paul Appeal, which is a black newspaper. He was not only very, very established in white community, he was a barber. He clearly worked with this group of white singers. He was a caterer known for cooking amazing meals. Again, more of service roles still, but very, very integrated into society. On his obituary at the bottom that I don't have showing here, it says that all of his pallbearers were white men, and it says they were old time friends from the old times. So, again, he came quite early. He was in Rice County by late 1860s, early 1870s. So that would be how he was almost one of the pioneering members of town in a sense. What was I going to say? I lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. It's so weird to keep looking at myself. Okay, so I know the other thing I was going to say. So in addition to his work and being such an integral member of the white community, he was very, very, very active in the black community. He, like some of the other people I talked about, was very politically active. He attended barbering events that were integrated, but he also attended things to help with the vote, things to help with black delegates and black causes. But he also took part in a lot of celebrations, right? Part of this larger black community that was black families from not only Rice County, but the counties around, and also even counties into Iowa. And they would all get together and have celebrations together. This is a newspaper article talking about one of the Emancipation Day celebrations. And Emancipation Day didn't used to actually be a Juneteenth event. It was to celebrate in August, which was the emancipation of the West Indies. So I think that's really fascinating. We don't know about that anymore. It's not really something that carried through in the history that people celebrated various emancipation days. And again, the newspapers have been great because they've shown how different people from different communities are connected by listing them at various times when they talk about the colored folk, as it says here, celebrating the Emancipation Day. I'm going to stop here because it is 6:30. I think the last thing I want to mention before we go to questions is, although I've talked a lot about, how people live their lives, the ways they came to town, the jobs they had when they were in town, it's really important to note that there was some clear opposition to people being there. I do have in the exhibit a newspaper clipping from Red Wing when the KKK marched ahead of the parade for the 4th of July. And it was an ad that said, "Come on out, the KKK is marching at 9. It'll be great fun." And then the parade with the buglers for the 4th of July starts at 10. So clearly, not everybody had the same feelings about there being Black people in town. Red Wing had one of the largest populations of African Americans outside of Duluth and the Twin Cities. So I don't know if that might be why they may have had more of a presence there. Other people, were almost seen as caricatures. There's a man named Nick Taylor, who is also Robert Taylor. And there's a whole newspaper article about him that's in the exhibit where he's referred to by some other names that aren't his name, but it's almost an ode to him in this. He was a watermelon salesman. So just adding to any stereotype you can think of a man who was a watermelon salesman who was also a Black person in town. So I'm going to pause here and stop sharing just so I can do questions. And then we'll go from there. I have a couple other things I'll say at the end.
Okay, thank you, Mica. There are quite a few questions. You answered some of them as you went along, but I will back up and ask a few of them. Okay, one person has asked, I'm curious, how many Black individuals or families did you research, and any single story that astounded you?
Yeah, I don't even know, Jeff, how many people I researched. Partly that's because I worked in concert with, like I said, I had 3 amazing helpers who all volunteered their time to go page by page, line by line with me. Um, I have compiled all of my information, but it's so hard to know my total numbers because certain people, we found them again in that 1865 census. It's just a line that indicated one Black person was living somewhere. And so we would try and find them. And so they're in all of my records, but I didn't really keep as much of a file on them because nobody could ever find anything else about them. So I knew somebody was going to ask that too. I thought, how should I count everybody? I have no idea. I made this amazing tree on Ancestry, which is not a plug for them, but I was able to create a tree where all of the families are on the same tree, even though they're not related. So there was a neat sort of technique I used to do that, but it's so hard to know. I mean, I would say between us, we found at least 100 people.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, but like some of them were one-offs, or some of them were the descendants, right? So it'd be a husband and a wife, and then their kids. So it's hard to know because in addition to just researching the families, what I don't talk about in the presentation today or in the panels is part of the project really was to try and find living descendants. Because like I said, they're the keepers. This stuff isn't in museums to the same extent. It's still in people's houses. It's still in their attics. It's in their basements. But if somebody had 10 kids, how do you know which kid got the stuff, right? So trying to find descendants has been really hard. But that's why the numbers are so high, is because for some of the families, we have a lot more descendants that we've found.
How many descendants have you found? And do you have a follow-up project with that?
Yeah, so I don't even know how many descendants I've found. For some families, there might have been 4 kids, and for one of them, I'm able to trace them. Honestly, and this is something that is true in genealogy as well, for the families that's, I'm going to use the word switched over to white, I don't know another way to say that, right? They have been easier to trace, which is the case in a lot of genealogy as well. And sometimes the families intentionally became white passing, and other times, like I mentioned, it doesn't seem that it was intentional. It's just that it may have been a very light-skinned man married a white woman, and their kids by default were just always listed as white, and then married white people and just became white.
Okay.
So yeah.
And then,
oh, sorry, you asked another question. Follow-up project. I don't have one specifically on the descendants to date. I kind of wanted to keep tracing them, and I would love, in my heart of hearts, to have some COVID-friendly reunion of all the descendants at the museum before it closes. That's like what I would love to do, but we'll see.
oh, that would be great. And maybe after COVID, we can still plan something like that. There's a question from Say2 that says, well, a comment, fantastic. You have to write a book. So I'll ask the question, have you ever thought about writing a book?
No, but it's been suggested to me multiple times. My mom's probably on here, so she's gonna laugh. I actually don't like writing, which is funny because I wrote all that text on all those panels. I know, I see your face too, Miss Tina. It's very stressful for me. I'd much rather show it in photo form, or just talk about it. But there's no way to do all of this on 7 panels. So
Mm-hmm.
something has to exist that brings all these stories to light, because there's so many more people who I haven't even talked about. And there's so much more depth than what I can go into in 150 words on a panel. So yes, say two, it's probably going to happen. You can keep bothering me about it. And one of the people with whom I worked on this project, who I'm going to call research assistant, but they're very well aware they're not research assistants. They've written a book on some of the Czech families from the Owatonna area. So I know we've talked about that in terms of this project as well.
Okay. And then Kate said that there might be a clue as to why, I think it was Ben that was called professor. She said sometimes musicians and music directors were known as professors. Did you come
Ooh.
across any of that in your research?
No, but thank you, Kate. We're going to dive deeper into that. I will definitely keep looking, because I know I've talked with the folks at Rice County. We have been curious how Ben Day became Professor Ben Day. He's always listed as professor in all newspapers in Rice County, but in all the St. Paul newspapers, he's just listed as Ben. So that's why it's like, I don't know quite what that means.
Okay. And Alexa says, as a Black Minnesotan, I've appreciated learning this material so much. Thank you. You were great.
Thank you.
And can you just talk about how difficult it is to research African American history, and then particularly in states such as Minnesota, which are majority white? Is that even then more difficult?
Yeah, so African American research in general, kind of like I was saying, it's harder because a lot of the stuff that ends up in museums is because either somebody well known or somebody with money had their stuff donated on their own behalf, or their descendants donated it. So it's not in the archives as much, if even in some places. Um, for a lot of African Americans um, who were just regular folk that had regular money, we'll say, right? They they're not in the records the same way. They don't own land, so I don't have land records. Some of them didn't go to school if they were working on farms, so I don't necessarily have school records. Um, Maybe of their kids, there might be some records, a descendant level down or two, but that's been really, really difficult because the records just don't exist. Like I said, I don't think this project would have been possible without the newspapers, honestly. It wouldn't have had the breadth that it has. Specifically for Minnesota, I think it is more difficult, partly like I talked about with the census, where you don't even know people are Black because somebody just put a W at the top of the page and ran a line down it. So you don't even know if you're looking at the proper family. You know, if
Mhm.
you see a family with the last name Jones or Smith, and then 10 years later you see another Jones or Smith, it might be the same people. One was listed as Black, one's listed as white. I don't know if they're the same people or not. So that part makes it really hard from a census records place. In terms of even in the newspapers in the South, the newspapers and the city directories marked everybody. So if you were Black in the cities in the South, even the city directories put either a C or an asterisk by your name. Um, in the North, that's not done as much, specifically in Minnesota. So it's harder to just try and comb through records and find Black people.
Mhm. Okay. And then Mary Boyd said that Benjamin Day's story reminds me of the barber Timothy Howard in St. Paul Rondo community. Are you familiar with Timothy Howard and
No,
his
but
story?
I'm gonna look him up. Thanks, Miss Mary Kay. I definitely will look into him. It sounds like he was kind of a mover and a shaker as well. Yeah, we'll definitely look into him. Let me write that down. Hmm.
And then there's a question. Do you know about the Curry and Wallace families that lived in Hastings? They and other families founded an AME church called Brown's Chapel. It was founded in 1893, but was burned by arson in 1907, and they were prominent Black families in Hastings. James Curry died in 1932, and all businesses in Hastings closed for his funeral. Are you familiar with that story?
Yeah, so Hastings had uh, quite a little pocket Black community. They're in Dakota County, and so I stopped right below them. But I am familiar with them, and I think Miss Coventry, doesn't her family come from Hastings? The
I
other,
believe she has some relatives
yeah,
from
so the
there.
other co-founder of the museum. But yeah, there's an amazing history in Hastings.
And there's a question from Joan. What collected what collected art have you installed? What was your criteria? What is pictures of the people or something else? Was it pictures of the people or something else?
Yeah. So for the exhibit, it is a traveling exhibit. So hopefully, after it leaves the museum, it will go on um, to the various places after that. So each of the panels is flat. So it's I don't have any three-dimensional artifacts, but partly how people were selected really did have to do with are there newspaper clippings or are there photographs of them, and they kind of made the quote unquote cut for the exhibit just because it needed to have a visual component to it. um, so like I said, it's mostly photographs, newspaper clippings, or yeah yeah, I think that's about it. A couple photos of things that aren't people, but mostly portraits and newspaper clippings.
And then Susan and Mike said that you all researched about 50 families, which is probably about 150 plus people.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. So Susan and Mike were two of my amazing helpers. They're the ones who have the book about the Czech families. So
Oh,
fun,
okay.
quick fact is the way I found them was I'd had just a couple little notes on my Joseph Parker family tree about the popes. So I'd started researching Jane and Jerry Pope, that early family in Owatonna. And because my tree was semi-private, semi-public, Mike was able to find me because he was looking for descendants too, because he actually comes from Owatonna, as where he was raised, I believe, Mike. Um, and so we were both kind of on the same hunt at the same time. And so we said, let's connect. So it was a really amazing opportunity.
Okay. And oh, someone asked if the recording will be available. And yes, the museum will post the recording on our YouTube channel, and then you can access it there. So I'll give more information about that. Angela said, also among early African American communities, learned people were very respected and given the title of professor. So that may also be a reason for the title.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
And then Alice said, have you ever gone with the people living now to find out about how they got to Minnesota?
Yes. So that's actually what started the project, was the living descendants of Joseph and Amelia. Um, and I traced back and found Joseph and Amelia. I didn't know they existed. And that was actually how the whole project started in like 2013, 2014.
Okay. There's lots of thank yous to you, Micah. And trying to find if there's some other questions. Oh, James Curry wants to connect. And James, I believe, is researching his family that's in Hastings, the family in Hastings. So we definitely will connect you two. And then there's a couple questions in the Q&A. Oh, someone asked where the museum is. The museum is located in Minneapolis on the north side, and I can type in the address in the chat. And then someone asked, what is the time frame that you covered on the initial census searches?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Ricky. So the census searches we started with were 1865 was the first one. So obviously, but I'll share for everybody. So 1865 would have been the first census after the end of the Civil War. So it would have been people who came right after that Civil War ended. And so we did 1865 was where we started. 1870 Certain counties and areas we did the page by page, other counties we did not for 1870, just because there were so many more people in general living in the 11 county radius, not just Black families, that it was becoming quite a daunting task. But we tried. So yeah, 1865 and 1870 were the first ones. Then we did some in 1860 because some families were already here, and then Minnesota actually had an 1857 census to figure out if they had enough people for statehood. So we spent some time looking at that one also.
Okay. And then there's a question about how does cultural anthropology play a role in this?
That is a good question. I think for me, the lens through which I usually look is a historian lens, genealogist lens. But I think at the end of the day, it all kind of comes down to cultural anthropology when you start talking about the why and the how. So I think it just kind of blends in. It wasn't my initial starting point, but I think as I got to the level of once I knew who the family was, trying to learn about that family and their lives, I think it blended in really nicely.
Okay. And then I believe this is our last question. Did you uncover any stories of early movement work of people resisting and working for civil rights?
Yes. I don't think they would have called it civil rights the way we call it civil rights now. But we did uncover people going to St. Paul to help. There was a African American man who wanted to be a delegate for the at the time Republican, because Republicans and Democrats used to be switched, Republican National Convention. So there were a lot of people who were trying to help him win his seat as a Black man, as a delegate. He did not end up getting it. There were stories of people working really hard to give Black people the right to vote because there'd been, I don't remember if it was, I think they had to do an amendment to do it because originally it was written specifically that Black people, Black men at the time, did not have the right to vote. So there was a lot of action around trying to make sure that Black men could get the right to vote.
And then there's one other question. Do you feel that color was less of an issue as these people immigrated?
Color was less. Not quite clear on that one, so let me see if I can figure out, or if you want to add any extra. So I'll answer it as best I can. So as various populations moved in, especially European populations, African Americans kind of changed. I guess they kind of jockeyed for position in terms of social status. Like I said, the Irish were seen as kind of less than African Americans at one point. Certain ethnic groups were seen as similar. Certain ethnic groups felt more camaraderie with the experiences of the early African Americans because they also came from very impoverished backgrounds, some of them. And obviously, I want to make it very clear not every African American that came to Southeast Minnesota came from an impoverished background, and not everybody came as a formerly enslaved person. So I guess I want to put that out there. But I don't know if that answers your question exactly.
Okay, if we have no further questions, I just want to thank everyone for joining us and thank Mica for your excellent presentation. And just let everyone know that we have 3 other conversations that the museum will be hosting this month for Black History Month. And you can find information about those on our website or on our Facebook page. And thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you. I'm not going to do like an Oscar speech, but I had some amazing help from some of the local historical societies. I think Rice County was amazing. And then not only the Historical Society, but also Jeff in Rice County and Sue, obviously, at the Historical Society. I, like I said, had some great research helpers and then some amazing editors to make it all pull together at the end. So I know my name is on it, but I don't ever want to say that I did it alone. There was no way I could have done this alone. So yeah.
All right, well, thank you. And everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.